Kumusta at salama. Hello, and thank you for having me. My name is Katherine Bishop, and I'm with you in virtual format today to talk about biological anthropology. To get us started today, I want to show you a meme that I see reposted every year, and it's one that I always show my classes. It asks, how long does somebody have to be dead before it's considered archaeology instead of grave robbing? This can be a really awkward question, but it's an important concept for us to consider, especially as you enter a course on biological remains and often sensitive materials concerning deceased, descendant, and living populations. Chances are good that I'm the only one in this lecture or looking at this lecture who may have worked with human remains, and that's okay. But why have I worked with them? My name is Katherine Bishop, and I'm a PhD candidate in anthropology. I've worked with human remains as an osteologist for archaeological sites or digs in Italy, Peru, and Greece, and as a forensic anthropologist in different areas of Canada. I'm also currently working at a heritage farm here in Ontario, Canada, doing similar work. But why am I allowed to work with human bones or any of the biological materials that I study, which often includes animal bones like the bison mandible shown above or shown below? So this concept is something we're going to be discussing today to get a better idea of case studies for today as well as in the future. Whenever you come across biological anthropology in the news, in this class, or even in pop culture references, I want you to consider the ethics of it. What ethical considerations are there for working with those materials? What do those ethics mean to you, especially with the biological materials or bones? And how does that change depending on the context? So let's go back to our meme. It's summarized as, at what point is it ethically okay to use human remains? Let's work through a few examples. So either pull out a piece of paper and a pen, pull up a Word document on your device, or dictate your thoughts or answers to yourself using a recorder. Most devices have them. I'm going to show you 4 images with real human bones. And I'll give you some space during the lecture. I'll probably do about 15 to 20 seconds, but feel free to pause the presentation if you have more things you want to write down. You're going to be writing down what comes to mind. Is this an acceptable use of human remains? And I'll ask that same question during each slide. These notes are going to be for your own personal records. They're not going to be submitted to Kevin. You can build on them. You can revisit them as they go, and it's really to get you started. Okay? So is this an acceptable use of human remains? 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 So chances are good that each of you had a different response, and I bet different reactions to each picture. I've shown this to students in different classes, from different backgrounds, cultures, and nationalities, and there's always different reactions, but there's also similar reactions too, on how people feel what is or is not acceptable, and especially why or why not. But what if we had context? So we're going to do the same exercise again. I'm going to show you the exact same images, but this time I want to give you the context so you can see if your ideas change on whether or not it's ethically okay. So feel free to rewrite your thoughts on a new piece of paper, use the same one. I'm going to be asking the exact same questions. I'll give you a little bit less time, but I will be giving you the context for each. Okay. This is a medical student learning about the human body for treatment purposes to help others. Is this an acceptable use of human remains? This is an archaeologist analyzing a burial as part of a recovery operation. The bones were at risk of being destroyed because of development. The archaeologist is trying to do an analysis to determine as much information about the person as they can prior to reburying them. Is this an acceptable use of human remains? This is the Sedlec Ossuary, which is part of the Roman Catholic Chapel in the Czech Republic. These decorations are from about 70,000 people that have been interred there since 1278, either as part of the Black Death, the Hussite Wars, or just other things within the communities. The movement of their bones and decoration with the bones is largely due to renovations and movement over time. Is this an acceptable use of human remains? This bag went on sale last year, and according to the retailer, the shell is made of alligator tongue, the handle is made of an entire child's spine who had osteoporosis, and all materials are reported to be ethically sourced. Is this an example, or is this an appropriate use of human remains? So there are two aims to this exercise. The first is really for you to start coming to terms with how you feel about the use of human remains. Biological anthropology involves the study of human remains, bones, in various forms, and you may struggle with studying them. Each of us is going to have different ideas about this, what may or may not be acceptable to you. And although I'm only part of your class for a short while today, these are concepts that you can collectively work with the students in your class, with your professor, with family members. You can collectively build on these ideas. That's one of the reasons why we had two parts to the exercise, where you could go back and see how your ideas may or may not have changed. And the second part of this exercise is that context matters. So part of this course, you're going to be looking through case studies with mainstream media, and I think it's important to engage with your own biases of concepts of reality. I want you to question your surroundings. Feel comfortable questioning what you see and what you think about your own ideas critically. And some of you may be thinking, okay, context really doesn't matter. My answers did not change when you gave me context. Okay. What if instead of a real skeleton on the bag, it was a replica? Instead of a bag, it was a Halloween decoration or a tattoo? Would it change how you felt about it? Instead of the church, what if it was a ceremony for your ancestors as part of the Day of the Dead tribute? And in terms of the medical student, what if I told you that those remains were robbed from somebody's grave 50 years ago, last week? Something that's often done with medical samples. How does it change whether or not it's okay? I'm going to pose this question now because it's one I continuously revisit. What are your personal views on the ethical use or misuse of human and non-human primate materials in biological anthropology? What I considered clear-cut when I first started bioanthropology has definitely become more clouded based on the interactions with communities that I study, including my own. And I want to explain why. We're not always faced with a should this or should this not be done. Sometimes it's salvage. Sometimes lives are going to depend on it. The example of Henrietta Lacks is one that is particularly important, especially now. So the example that I just showed you were of human bones, but human remains can actually include a number of different things. It can include DNA and other genetic material, health, or demographic information. The example I'm going to show you is of Henrietta Lacks, and because of the unethical use of her remains, millions of people have lived. While you're watching or rewatching this video, I want you to consider a few things. Is what happened to her ethical? This example took place in 1951, some 70 years ago. So why or how do the ethics impact us today? And what steps are being taken now, and why are those important? If for whatever reason the audio or the video doesn't work, I've included the YouTube link to the video itself, and I want you to go and check it out if it doesn't work here. But consider all of these things as we go through it.
Lacks was a sort of poor black tobacco farmer who grew up in Southern Virginia. And in 1951, she was diagnosed with cervical cancer. At that point, she had moved up to Baltimore, and she went to Johns Hopkins for treatment because it was the only place anywhere near her that treated black patients. So this was the era of segregation, and the hospitals had the quote-unquote colored wards, which was the only place that black patients or poor patients could be seen. And without telling her, before treating her tumor, her doctor just cut a little piece and put it in a dish. And he sent that down the hall to George Guy, who was the head of tissue culture research at Hopkins. And George Guy had been trying to grow human cells outside of the body for decades, and it had never worked. And for reasons that remain a mystery, Henrietta cells just never died. So they started doubling their numbers every 24 hours. They went from like 1 dish to 2 to 4 to 8 to 16, and then just sort of pretty quickly took over the lab. And George Guy started calling his colleagues and saying, I think I have the first immortal human cell line, which is what they're called, which means they'll just grow and divide forever. And in response, his colleagues all said, great, can we have some? Because there had been this enormous effort to grow cells outside the body for 100 years, because we really didn't know a lot about cells at that point. And in response to all of his colleagues asking for them, George Guy sent them to anyone who wanted to use them for research. And they spread around the world this way really fast. And they were one of the most important things that happened to medicine. They were used to help create the polio vaccine. They went up to the first space missions to see what would happen to human cells in zero gravity. They were used to create our most important cancer medications like vincristine and tamoxifen. Her cells were the first ever cloned, her genes some of the first ever mapped. They were used to help develop in vitro fertilization. Basically, almost all of the vaccines we take today can be traced back to research with her cells. There isn't a person out there who hasn't benefited from research on her cells.
The surprising tenacity of her cancer cells, which made them so important to medical research, also ultimately took her life. Henrietta Lacks died in October 1951, at the age of 31. As her cells were taken without her knowledge, in an era before the concept of informed consent existed, Henrietta died never knowing how important her cells would be. Even her family didn't learn of the true extent of her legacy until science writer Rebecca Skloot began working with Henrietta's daughter Deborah to uncover the truth almost 5 decades later.
Rebecca, she worked hand in hand with my mother, Deborah Lacks. They went on journeys to Clover, Virginia, to talk to family members. They did a lot of work together. They hit the road a lot. They put a lot of miles on their cars. My mom was 2 years old when Henrietta passed away. So she never knew her mother.
As Deborah learned about these things, there's so much mixed emotion in it, because on the one hand, look at all this incredible stuff my mother did for science and for the world. That gave her a level of peace with her mother's death that she had wanted her entire life. At the same time, there was a lot of anger about the fact that everyone has benefited from these cells except her family.
This information was out there for so many years, and the family was not even aware of Henrietta's, that they had taken cells from Henrietta Lacks, and these cells have been used all over the world by scientists, labs, researchers, and millions of dollars have been made, and you still have the family struggling with basic health care. You know, we gotta recognize the past, but kind of like move forward and move in a positive direction to make sure that this doesn't happen again to our family or anybody else's family. And the Lacks family is making sure that we continue to move forward to honor and preserve her legacy and speak about her life.
So they collaborated with the NIH and formed what's known as the Gila Genome Committee, where a few members of the Lacks family and a group of scientists sit on this committee, and anyone who wants to do research with the Henrietta's genome have to put in an application that is reviewed by members of the family and the NIH. scientists. It was unprecedented. There's never been a moment like that where research, quote unquote, research subjects were a part of the decision-making mechanism of science.
The family now has a seat at the table. So instead of us being the last to know, we will be the first to know.
So the case of Henrietta Lacks is one that I've struggled with. In my mind, what happened to her was wrong. Her remains were taken without her knowledge or her permission. But knowing what has happened because it was done is an ethical issue for me. My friends and family, they've benefited because of her cells. We can't go back and change what happened, but we can do something about it. Her descendants have taken over the rights and responsibilities of her materials and their use, and her case has become an example of how to be better. And her story is being told and retold in this way as a form of dissemination. Her case has direct parallels to biological anthropology. It's also how we approach the discipline. We can't go back and change what we were, but we can do the right thing with what we're doing now. You may have read in your textbook the history of this field, that during the 19th and 20th centuries, white male researchers differentiated people based on their physical features, skin color, and skull sizes, which fueled eugenics research during World War II. So this racist tone to anthropology continued until the late 70s and 80s and into the 21st century, when we shifted more towards biological anthropology. So you'll notice that instead of saying physical anthropology, I'm focusing more on biological anthropology. Remembering that we're strongly rooted in racism, but instead of the physical distances between us, we're focusing on the biology that connects us. Which is why our field is so reliant on ethics. And this whole time I've been discussing ethics with you. It's part of my ethical responsibility as a bioanthropology educator. It's part of my giving back or trying to make amends for the field's past. So science communication is one of the ways that I disseminate research in this field. And I'll give you a few more examples as we go through it. But so far we've gone through some of the ethical challenges. But what ethical documents are there? As a quick review, the University of Philippines database led me to this post, Let's Get Ethical from UP Manila. In the article, it says that there's no research project that happens prior to the review and approval. So research is held accountable. Awesome. What stuck out for me is that the guiding rule here is that participants are protected. But how does this relate to anthropology? So part of this report also said that the approval came from the Philippine Health Research Ethics Board, PHREB. Although a quick search of it didn't yield any skeletal or anthropology-specific ethical considerations, we can still use it as a guiding approach. If you're wanting one that's a little bit more thorough, specific to biological anthropology, I refer to the one that I am guided by, the Canadian Association of Physical Anthropology. And yes, they are going to be changing their name from physical anthropology to biological anthropology. But this is their most recent code of ethics from 2015, and they keep revising it, they keep changing it. Under this code, any biological anthropologist has the responsibility to the people of the study, skeletal remains, tissues, or other biological samples, which includes their well-being, safety, dignity, and privacy, as well as material curation and conservation. It also means I have a responsibility to the descendant group, including following their wishes for the materials. I have a responsibility to non-human primates and other animals of study, including the stewardship of materials. I have a responsibility to scholarship and science, which means actually disseminating research and maintaining integrity for future researchers. I also have to make information accessible where appropriate, which is a responsibility to the public. Now, I've outlined the third criteria here, as it is specific to the Canadian Association because of what has traditionally been done in Canada. Similar to Henrietta Lacks, the remains of Indigenous peoples, including their ancestors, ancestral grounds, tissues, and living communities, have been studied and used by researchers in the past without their consent. Part of reconciliation and moving forward is to recognize the past and consult in every way that we can to move forward. So this is Canada, and I was trying to find something comparable to the Philippines, which led me to the work of 3 researchers at the University of Philippines, Diliman. They specifically evaluated universal bioethical documents and found that the decision-making process, it was just too universalized. So instead of having a code of ethics that applies to all of the world, they found that it didn't work with communities here because it didn't take into account local principles or lived experiences specific to each area, which will always modify or change your approach. So I took their approach and I applied it to how we approach biological anthropology in different communities. So we have a responsibility to gather data from the community, living or deceased, to consult with those communities, to be open to revising how we interpret and apply their approach, and to make all data available. So there's a number of ways we can conduct or apply biological anthropology today, and this is about the giving back part. Ways that we can ethically conduct the research, and in doing so, give back to different communities. The basis of biological anthropology is to understand the evolutionary past of humans while looking forward to how that impacts our livelihoods today. So forensic anthropology, skeletal analyses the use of forensic anthropology and skeletal analysis probably began after World War II. Woltz and Krogman in 1939. They used it as a skeletal identification guide for the FBI to identify war dead that were being repatriated and brought back. So in the Philippines, it's been used after typhoons and other mass casualty events, including the ferry disaster in 2008. Dr. Matthew Goh is a Filipino-Canadian who now works for an identification lab at the defense base at Pearl Harbor in the United States. But during his PhD research, he spent time in Manila creating the world's first reference collection comprised exclusively of contemporary Filipino skeletons. So as part of salvage archaeology, and they created this new collection, which is at the University of Philippines, Diliman. And it has the ability to potentially help identify victims of criminal cases, mass disasters, mass fatality events, and mass graves throughout Southeast Asia, which is one of the things that biological anthropology can do. We are able to connect people with loved ones now using forensic anthropology, and in the past using bioarchaeology. It's part of the restorative work that we're able to do. So as an archaeologist and an osteologist, I've had the opportunity to do work like this in my own community. Through the University of Alberta, I had the opportunity to work with the lead forensic anthropologist, Pamela Main-Karaya, who was asked to work on this project through the RCMP in Alberta. And I've worked on a few other cases with the RCMP through Pam Main-Karaya. So getting to be part, in very small part, of the analysis for this project, as well as the recovery, excavation work on others in Alberta and Ontario, I've been able to use the skills I learned in my undergrad to help bring closure to descendant communities. So this is an example outside of Viking, Alberta, where the remains of a girl were unearthed in a farmer's field. It was determined that it was about 150 to 200 years old, and she was a young Indigenous woman. So we were able to, just like one of those initial pictures, we were able to do salvage archaeology, do analysis of her remains, help to provide context for her reburial to understand who she was, because that would impact how she was reburied. And all of this was done in consultation with elders, in consultation with the local Indigenous communities. And the burial ceremony that you're seeing here involves a lot of those communities. It involves a lot of elders, potential descendants of this woman. So through forensic anthropology, we were able to bring dignity to her remains and others that may have been damaged naturally or because of human causes. Our skills can also be used for research purposes, which helps to connect the history for living communities as well as our deep evolutionary past. So the top image is of me working, I'm pickaxing in a Roman era cemetery in Italy. The soil here is so hard and so compact, you had to pickaxe. It's not sandy at all. So this research is still ongoing today. It's out of McMaster University in Ontario, Canada, and the lead excavator is Dr. Tracy Prowse. She's worked on this site for decades, and they've actually been excavating hundreds of human burials. They've been conducting analysis on, what these individuals ate, who they were, where they came from, what occupations they had. And this helps to complete a larger picture of who communities were, 2,000, 2,500 years ago, A lot of the big sites that you see are elite males. So this helps to understand, immigrants, locals, farmers, people of lower socioeconomic status, women and children, which to get that full picture of a community really does help in our understanding of our past. The image in the bottom right is actually from a field season from the Callao Cave in the Philippines, which is part of how biological anthropology can be applied to the distant past. So digging in the Philippines Callao Cave, researchers found teeth and bones that are believed to belong to a new ancestor of ours, so Homo luzonensis, who lived on the island of Luzon about 50,000 to 67,000 years ago. They found 7 teeth and 6 small bones from the hand and feet and part of the thigh. The human species is believed to be under 4 feet tall. And the key researchers of this amazing study are from UP Quezon City, UP Manila, and the picture in the bottom left corner, it's Dr. Mijares, who is from Quezon City and Manila. And he's actually showing the finger bone that they found compared to his own. So this is amazing research. They have an article published in Nature. It was featured all over the media, all over the news. And it's research kind of local to where you guys are now. It's just a fascinating study. So from the Callao Cave, I'm actually going to bring you back to the present and more of an exploratory type of research. So part of understanding who we are involves our relationship with animals. And my PhD research involves modern herds of sheep and goats. I'm actually working with I worked with a goat herd in Alberta, and I compared what I understood from that to the past. So I work in, modern current times, but I'm also understanding 2,500 years ago in Greece, so ancient Greece, what were the shepherds doing there with their animals, and how does that help us understand economy, society, politics, and even how that compares to shepherding now. So I use the mandible that you're seeing there and the teeth within them, but you can also use artifacts. So I'm showing a goat sculpture, not from our site, but from a similar site. So there's a lot of different ways that you were able to use biological anthropology as a way to understand, but to also make these connections now and in the past. But we can also use our understanding of the past to help us now. So this is an example from my colleague, Dr. Madeline Mant, who's a professor at the University of Toronto in Canada. And she uses written records to help us understand, physical remains of the past and today. She's here dressed in the traditional garb of a nurse from influenza, so from 100 years ago, and then a plague doctor. And it was an interview done with her that I felt just fascinating. And I'll read it to you. And it said, Canada is isolating due to a pandemic. Public meetings are banned. Theaters, schools, colleges, and churches are closed. Business hours are restricted across Canada. Sounds pretty familiar, doesn't it? This was 1918. So she is analyzing health records from hospitals, from individuals, and like the written records to understand health, opinions around health, how people were treated, how it often repeats itself, and how, especially now, how does understanding, influenza, the Black Death, things like that, even the AIDS crisis, how do those ideas and those notions help us better understand the COVID-19 pandemic? And how biological anthropologists are able to do this is through that integration of then and now. But this is another application of how we're able to use biological anthropology. So there's a lot. But when I revisit this meme, there may not be a difference between archaeology and grave robbing. We've discussed modern and ancient past. I don't think that there's an answer to this question. It's probably going to make you feel very uncomfortable, but it will get us thinking about why. So the history and the background of this field and what we're going to do about it. How do I answer this question? I don't consider a time period. I consider the reasoning, the cause. Who am I doing it for? And do they or their ancestors want it? Will it hurt living people? Will it help living people? Is it necessary? And if it's not necessary, Is it damaging? Do the benefits outweigh the costs? Is it ethical? And if it is deemed ethical and is conducted, how are you going to give it back? To who? And how can you make it happen? So this is just a number of things for you to think about as you go through this course, this field, how you talk with your classmates, and how you see different stories in the media. Hopefully, I've given you something a little bit different to think about today. Maraming salamat. And if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to email me, reach out, talk with Kevin, or send me an email. I'm always open to talking about this, and I'm excited for you to start engaging with it too. Thank you.